In the hushed, velvet-draped world of the Onyx Room, silence was a commodity. There was the polite silence of wealthy patrons pausing between bites of exquisitely plated food. And then there was Ella's silence. Hers was a different kind, a silence born of necessity, of survival. As a waitress, she had learned that her value was measured by her invisibility. She was a ghost who refilled wine glasses, a shadow who cleared plates. But locked away behind that silence was a voice, a powerful melodic secret she hadn't dared to share with the world. This is the story of the night her silence was broken, not by choice, but by force, and how a moment of profound humiliation became the stage for her unexpected triumph. Ella's day didn't start with the glamour of the Onyx Room, but in a small, cramped apartment where the morning light struggled to get in. Her first act was always for her mother, crushing pills into a spoonful of applesauce, a ritual of love and necessity. Her mother's illness was a quiet, constant hum beneath the surface of their lives, the driving force behind every long shift Ella endured. The uniform she put on was more than just clothing. It was armor. It was the price of admission to a world that would provide the money she needed, but at the cost of her own identity. The commute on the subway was a jarring transition between two realities. She would watch the faces of the other passengers, each lost in their own world, and wonder if any of them had dreams they had to lock away just to get by. Her dream had a sound. It was the memory of her own voice, soaring and free, from a time before life had clipped her wings. She used to sing at open mic nights in hole-in-the-wall cafes, her heart pounding with a joyful terror. Now the only stage she knew was the dining room floor of the Onyx Room, and the only sound she made was a polite, "Excuse me, sir." When she arrived at the restaurant, the familiar scent of truffle oil and simmering ambition greeted her. The head chef, Antoine, a man whose temper was as legendary as his culinary skill, gave her a brief, approving nod. He was one of the few people who saw the steel beneath her quiet exterior. "The Davenports are here tonight, table 7, he said, his voice low. "Be careful, they hunt for sport." The warning settled like a stone in her stomach. The Davenports. A name that was whispered with fear among the city's service staff. They were old money, with a cruelty to match. Ella smoothed her apron, her hands suddenly clammy. Tonight would be a test. She just didn't know it would be a test of her voice, not her service. The Onyx Room was a masterpiece of understated luxury. Dark mahogany walls, soft jazz from a live trio in the corner, and the low, confident murmur of the city's elite. For the patrons, it was a sanctuary. For the staff, it was a battlefield. Ella moved through it with the grace of a dancer, her silver tray held high, her expression a perfect mask of pleasant neutrality. She had learned to read the room, to anticipate a need before it was spoken, to become so efficient that she was essentially invisible. Tonight, however, her invisibility was being challenged. From the moment she approached table 7, she felt the weight of the Davenport family's gaze. It wasn't the usual indifference. It was an active, predatory scrutiny. Mr. and Mrs. Davenport and their 2 grown children watched her every move, their eyes cold and analytical, as if inspecting a piece of livestock. "The wine list," Mr. Davenport said, not looking at her, but at a point just past her shoulder. When she returned with the bottle he'd selected, his son smirked. "I wonder if she even knows the difference between a Bordeaux and a bottle of cheap table wine." His sister giggled, a sharp, unpleasant sound. Ella uncorked the bottle with steady hands, her face betraying nothing. Inside, her heart was pounding. She had served people richer and more famous than the Davenports, but she had never encountered such deliberate, casual cruelty. They weren't just ignoring her, they were actively trying to unnerve her, to make her crack. It was a game to them. Chef Antoine caught her eye from across the room, a silent look of support passing between them. He knew what was happening, but his hands were tied. The Davenports were regulars, their patronage too valuable to risk over a minor staff issue. It was up to Ella to endure. She tried to focus on her mother's face, on the list of medications she needed to buy, on the rent that was due. These were the reasons she swallowed her pride, the reasons she absorbed their contempt without a word. But with every condescending remark, every dismissive gesture, a small defiant spark began to glow within her. It was the part of her that remembered singing on a dimly lit stage, the part of her that knew she was more than a uniform and a tray. That spark was still small, but it was refusing to be extinguished. And as she returned to the table, she had no idea that the Davenports, in their arrogance, were about to pour gasoline on it. The Onyx Room was a stage, and tonight the Davenports were the directors of a cruel play. Ella moved with precision, her steps silent on the plush carpet, but she could feel their eyes on her, dissecting her every move. The air around their table was thick with an unspoken challenge. They weren't just dining, they were performing their superiority, and she was their unwilling prop. The restaurant was at its peak, a symphony of clinking silverware, hushed conversations, and the soft melody of the jazz trio. Golden light from the chandeliers cast a warm glow on the patrons, but for Ella, it felt like a harsh spotlight. As she approached the Davenports' table to clear the appetizer plates, Mrs. Davenport stopped her with a raised hand. "Tell me," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "do you enjoy this work, or is this just a temporary stop on the way to something more fitting for your station?" The question was a thinly veiled insult, designed to remind Ella of her place. The rest of the family watched with amused smiles, waiting for her reaction. Ella's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to say, "I dream of singing on a real stage, of moving people with my voice, of being more than just the person who serves you." But she couldn't. She simply offered a polite, practiced smile. "I take pride in my work, ma'am," she replied, her voice even. The son, a young man with his father's arrogant eyes, laughed. "Pride in serving people? That's a new one." The humiliation was a physical thing, a heat that spread through her chest. She could feel the eyes of nearby tables turning toward them, drawn by the scene. The pressure was immense, a suffocating weight. She just wanted to disappear. And it's in this moment of tension, with Ella standing on the edge of her composure, that I want to ask you, if you believe that a person's dignity is worth more than all the luxury in the world, please take a moment to like this video. It helps our channel grow and allows us to share more stories like this with people who need to hear them. Ella took a deep breath, her training kicking in. She ignored the comment and focused on clearing the plates, her movements swift and efficient. But as she turned to leave, the daughter, a girl no older than herself, deliberately shifted her chair, blocking Ella's path. It was a small, petty act of dominance. Ella paused, waiting, her tray held steady. The girl just stared at her, a smug look on her face. The entire table was watching, waiting to see what she would do. The silence stretched, each second a new layer of humiliation. Just as Ella was about to murmur an apology and try to squeeze past, a voice from another table, calm and clear, cut through the tension, changing the course of the entire evening. "Excuse me, I believe you're blocking the aisle." The voice was not loud, but it carried an undeniable authority that made everyone at the Davenport table turn. A few tables away, a man was looking directly at the daughter, his expression polite but firm. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, with silver hair at his temples that suggested both age and distinction. He held a wineglass loosely in his hand, but his eyes were sharp and focused. The Davenport daughter, flustered at being called out, quickly pulled her chair in. I didn't realize," she stammered, her smugness evaporating. The man, Mr. Allister, simply gave a slight nod and returned to his own conversation as if nothing had happened. But the spell was broken. The Davenports' private theatre of cruelty had been interrupted by an audience member who refused to play along. They exchanged irritated glances, their fun spoiled. Ella, grateful for the intervention, quickly moved past the table, her heart still racing. She didn't dare look at the man who had spoken up, but she was acutely aware of him now. He hadn't made a grand gesture, he had simply enforced a basic rule of decency, and in doing so had given her a moment of reprieve. From the safety of the kitchen, Chef Antoine watched her come in, his brow furrowed with concern. He had seen the whole exchange. "Are you all right, Ella?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. He knew she was being targeted, but he also knew that confronting the Davenports directly would be a disaster for the restaurant. His silent support, however, was a small comfort. As Ella returned to the dining room, she tried to avoid looking in Mr. Alastair's direction, but she could feel his presence. He wasn't staring at her, but she sensed he was aware of her, a quiet observer in the bustling room. Unlike the Davenports, who looked at her to diminish her, his brief glance had felt validating. It was as if he saw not just a waitress, but a person navigating a difficult situation with grace. The rest of the service at the Davenport table was tense. They were sullen and curt, their earlier amusement replaced by a simmering resentment. They made a few more passive-aggressive comments, but the joy had gone out of their game. The unseen observer had changed the dynamic. A small seed of defiance began to grow in Ella's heart. She was still afraid, but she was no longer just a victim. She was a survivor, and she had no idea that the man who had offered a single sentence of support was about to offer her a stage for her entire life. The pressure in the dining room was a palpable thing. Every time Ella approached the Davenport table, she felt a dozen pairs of eyes on her. The family, still smarting from Mr. Alastair's intervention, seemed determined to reassert their dominance. Their orders became more complicated, their tones more demanding, and their disdain more overt. Ella moved through it all with a fragile composure, her professional smile a thin shield against their relentless attacks. She tried to focus on the mechanics of her job, the balance of the tray, the precise angle for pouring wine, the silent clearing of plates. But her mind was a battlefield of fear and a burgeoning anger. With every snide comment and dismissive wave, she felt a piece of her spirit being chipped away. She was serving them a vintage Bordeaux, a wine that cost more per bottle than she made in a week. As she leaned in to refill Mr. Davenport's glass, his son made a sudden, jerky movement, bumping her arm. It was a small, almost imperceptible nudge, but it was enough. The heavy bottle tilted, and a stream of dark red wine cascaded onto the pristine white tablecloth, splashing onto Mr. Davenport's expensive silk tie. A horrified silence fell over the table, then the entire section of the restaurant. For a moment, no one moved. Ella stood frozen, the bottle still in her hand, her face draining of all color. Her heart plummeted. This was it, the one mistake she couldn't afford to make. Before she could even stammer an apology, the son burst out laughing, a cruel, triumphant sound. "I knew it!" he exclaimed, pointing at her. "She's completely incompetent. Can't even pour a glass of wine." The rest of the family joined in, their laughter echoing through the now silent dining room. "This is precisely why people like her don't belong in places like this," Mrs. Davenport declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. "She's ruined $1,000 tie and the ambiance of our entire evening." The humiliation was absolute. Patrons at other tables were staring, some with pity, others with a kind of morbid curiosity. Ella felt trapped, pinned by the weight of their collective gaze. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. With trembling hands, she placed the bottle on the table and began to blot the spill with a napkin, her movements clumsy with shame. "Careful, dear," Mrs. Davenport sneered. "You might make it worse, if that's even possible." From the kitchen doorway, Chef Antoine watched, his face a mask of fury. He clenched his fists, his knuckles white, but he was powerless. The Davenports were too influential. From his own table, Mr. Alastair observed the scene, his expression unreadable, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the unfolding drama. Ella, on her knees, dabbing at the stain, felt tears burning behind her eyes. She refused to let them fall. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry, but she didn't know how much more she could take. This accident, she thought, wasn't just a spill. It was the breaking point. The Davenports were reveling in their victory. They had finally broken her. Ella's public humiliation was their evening's entertainment, a story they would surely recount with glee at their country club. As she continued to clean the spill, her hands shaking, the son leaned forward, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Don't worry," he said loudly. "I'm sure they'll just take the cost of the tie out of your meager salary. You might have to work for a month to pay it off." His sister giggled. "A month? Be generous. It'll probably take her a year." The cruelty was so blatant, so unnecessary, that it seemed to suck the air out of the room. Ella felt a hot surge of anger, a feeling so intense it momentarily eclipsed her shame. She remembered her mother's words, "No one can steal the light God put inside you." She repeated the phrase in her mind like a mantra, a desperate prayer for strength. She could feel Mr. Alistair's gaze on her, not with pity, but with a kind of intense, watchful expectation. It was as if he was waiting to see what she would do. Something inside her shifted. The fear began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She had been silent for too long. Slowly, she rose to her feet, leaving the stained napkin on the table. She looked directly at the Davenport family, her eyes no longer downcast. There was a fire in them they had not seen before. "The tie can be replaced," she said, her voice quiet but clear, carrying across the silent room. "But a person's dignity, once you've tried to destroy it, is much harder to restore." The family stared at her, momentarily stunned by her audacity. Mr. Davenport was the first to recover, his face turning a shade of purple. "How dare you?" he sputtered. "You are fired! Get out of my sight!" But before he could continue his tirade, Mr. Alistair stood up from his table. He placed his napkin calmly on his plate and began to walk toward them. His movements were unhurried, but every person in the room felt the shift in power. He didn't stop at the Davenports' table. He walked directly to Ella. "That was the bravest thing I have seen in a very long time," he said to her, his voice full of warmth and respect. He then turned to face the Davenports, his expression hardening. "As for you," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone, "you seem to be under the impression that your wealth gives you the right to treat people with contempt. You are mistaken." The entire restaurant was holding its breath. The confrontation was no longer between a wealthy family and a waitress. It was between two titans, and Ella was at the center of it all. She didn't know it, but the man who had just defended her was about to turn her entire world upside down. A tense, electric silence gripped the dining room. The patriarch of the Davenport family, his face still flushed with anger, scoffed at Mr. Alistair. "And who are you to lecture me on etiquette?" he demanded, trying to reclaim his authority. "Some self-righteous busybody?" Mr. Alistair didn't flinch. He simply looked at Mr. Davenport with a calm, penetrating gaze. "My name is Alistair Finch," he said, his voice even, "and I know this young woman from another context. I can assure you she possesses more value than you can possibly comprehend." Ella's heart leaped into her throat. "He knows me." She searched her memory, but she couldn't place his face. The entire room seemed to lean in, captivated by the unfolding drama. Mr. Alistair continued, his voice resonating with conviction. "A few weeks ago I was walking through Washington Square Park and heard a voice so pure, so filled with honest emotion, that it stopped me in my tracks. It was this young woman, singing for a small crowd with nothing but a guitar and her soul. She doesn't deserve to be ridiculed. She deserves to be applauded." The revelation hung in the air. The image of the clumsy, incompetent waitress was suddenly replaced by that of a soulful artist. The Davenports looked utterly bewildered, their narrative shattered. A murmur of support rippled through the other patrons, their expressions shifting from curiosity to empathy. Then Mr. Alistair did something audacious. He turned to Ella, his eyes full of a challenging warmth. "Ella," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "show them who you really are. Sing for them. Let your voice be the only thing they remember from this night." The entire restaurant held its breath. Ella felt a wave of panic. Sing? Here? In front of the very people who had just humiliated her? It was an impossible request. It meant laying her soul bare, making herself even more vulnerable. Her first instinct was to refuse, to run and hide. But then she looked at the faces in the crowd, the sneering Davenports, the now curious patrons, and the steady, encouraging eyes of Mr. Alistair. She realized she had nothing left to lose. If she was going to fall, she would fall as herself. And you, who are listening to this story, what would you do in her place? If you believe that courage can turn any moment of shame into a moment of glory, please like this video and share it with someone who needs this message. Your support helps us spread stories that truly matter. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Ella closed her eyes. The cacophony of the restaurant faded away, replaced by the frantic beating of her own heart. For a moment, there was only fear. But then she thought of her mother, of the music that had been her only solace on the darkest days. She thought of Mr. Alistair's belief in her. A new feeling, a quiet, defiant courage began to rise within her. It was time to turn her pain into power. The first note she sang was soft, almost a whisper, but it was so pure and clear that it cut through the tense atmosphere like a beam of light. As her voice grew stronger, a profound silence fell over the entire dining room. Conversation stopped. Forks were set down. The jazz trio in the corner lowered their instruments, their faces filled with awe. Ella sang a simple, soulful ballad, a song of struggle and hope. Her voice was not just technically perfect, it was drenched in raw, honest emotion. It carried the weight of every early morning, every long commute, every swallowed insult. It was the sound of her resilience, her pain, and her unbreakable spirit. The patrons were no longer watching a waitress. They were witnessing an artist. The Davenport family sat frozen, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning shame. The weapon they had used against her, public humiliation, had been turned back on them. There was no room for their mockery in the face of such undeniable talent. Their arrogance seemed to shrink and wither in the presence of her authentic power. Ella, lost in the music, poured every ounce of herself into the song. It was a cry of freedom, a declaration that she was more than her uniform, more than their judgment. Her voice soared through the opulent room, filling every corner with a beauty and truth that no amount of money could buy. Mr. Alistair watched her, a quiet, proud smile on his face. He had known she had this in her. He had simply given her the stage. When the final note faded into the air, the silence that followed was even more profound. It lasted for a long, breathless moment. Ella opened her eyes, her heart pounding, unsure of what to expect. Then, a single person began to clap. It was quickly followed by another and another, until the entire restaurant erupted in a thunderous standing ovation. Tears streamed down Ella's face as the sound washed over her, not the sound of ridicule, but the sound of pure, heartfelt applause. The humiliation had been transformed into triumph. In that moment, she was not a waitress. She was a star. The applause continued for what felt like an eternity, a wave of validation that washed away the stains of the evening's cruelty. Ella stood in the center of the room, her hands clasped in front of her, bowing her head as tears of relief and gratitude streamed down her cheeks. She looked up and saw faces all around her smiling, some patrons even wiping away tears of their own. She had connected with them in a way that went far beyond service. She had touched their souls. The waiters and kitchen staff, who had been watching from the doorways, joined the applause, their cheers the loudest in the room. They were clapping not just for her voice, but for her courage. She had stood up to the kind of customer they all dreaded, and she had won. Chef Antoine emerged from the kitchen, a wide, proud grin on his face. and gave her a resounding applause of his own. Amidst the celebration, the Davenport family was a small, isolated island of discomfort. Their faces were red with a mixture of anger and public shame. They had been defeated, their power rendered meaningless by a simple song. Without a word, Mr. Davenport threw some cash on the table and led his family in a hasty, undignified exit, unable to bear another moment in a room where they were no longer the center of attention. Their departure was met with a few scattered, sarcastic claps from nearby tables. As the applause finally subsided, Mr. Alistair approached Ella, his eyes shining with pride. "I knew the world needed to hear that voice," he said, his voice warm. "Tonight was just the beginning." Several other patrons came forward to congratulate her, pressing business cards into her hand. "You have a gift," an elegant older woman told her. "Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." The restaurant manager, who had been watching in stunned silence, came over, his expression one of pure awe. "Ella," he said, I don't know what to say. That was extraordinary." But it was Mr. Alistair's next words that changed everything. "Ella," he said, his voice serious now, "my name is Alistair Finch and I own a small independent record label. I didn't just happen to be here tonight. I came here hoping to find you again. I want to offer you a recording contract." The room fell silent once more. A record deal. It was the dream she had locked away, the future she had never dared to imagine. It was happening right here, in the aftermath of her deepest humiliation. Ella left the Onyx Room that night, not as a waitress, but as an artist with a future. The cold night air felt different on her skin, charged with possibility. The city lights no longer seemed like a distant, unattainable world. They felt like a promise. As she walked home, the memory of the applause was a symphony in her ears, drowning out the echoes of the Davenports' cruel laughter forever. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. True to his word, Mr. Alistair guided her into the world of music. She spent her days in a recording studio, a place that felt more like home than the restaurant ever had. Her voice, once a private secret, now filled microphones, ready to be shared with the world. She wrote songs about her life, her struggles, and her unwavering hope, transforming her pain into powerful, relatable art. She was able to provide for her mother, not just with medicine, but with comfort and peace of mind, knowing her daughter was finally living her dream. The uniform was retired, replaced by the simple, comfortable clothes of a musician. The silver tray was replaced by a guitar. Her first single, a soulful ballad inspired by that fateful night at the restaurant, was released a few months later. It became an unexpected hit, a viral sensation praised for its raw honesty and emotional power. People connected with her story, the story of the underdog, the invisible girl who found her voice. Ella never forgot where she came from. She remained the same humble, hard-working woman, but now her work was her passion. The humiliation she had endured had not broken her, it had forged her. It had given her a story to tell and a voice with which to tell it. And now I speak to you, who have followed this journey to its inspiring conclusion. Like Ella, you may have felt silenced or overlooked. But remember that your voice has power and your story has value. If this story has touched your heart, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments what part of Ella's journey meant the most to you. And don't go anywhere. Another story of hope and triumph is waiting for you right here. That night at the Onyx Room, a waitress was humiliated. But from the ashes of that moment, a star was born, her light shining all the brighter for the darkness she had overcome.